What happens when one of the most powerful voices in hip-hop decides to release footage that allegedly exposes the very people who once stood beside him? That question is now sitting at the center of a growing industry storm around 50 Cent. And according to emerging reports, the reaction behind the scenes is far more intense than anything being shown publicly. Multiple artists across the industry are not just watching this unfold, they're pushing back, silently, strategically, and in some cases very directly. At the heart of the controversy is a newly surfaced documentary clip that reportedly began circulating in private circles before exploding onto social media. The footage is said to contain raw, unfiltered moments involving several well-known rappers, moments they believed would never leave controlled production environments. But once fragments of that material started leaking, the situation shifted instantly. What was supposed to be a curated narrative suddenly turned into something uncontrollable. Sources claim that several artists feel blindsided, accusing the project of selective editing, misrepresentation, and framing that alters the way they are being perceived. In their view, it's not just about what was shown, but how it was shown and what context may have been removed. Within hours, private frustration reportedly began spilling into public reaction. Social media lit up with cryptic messages, indirect responses, and carefully worded posts that hinted at deeper tensions without fully naming them outright. And that's where things started escalating. Because this no longer looks like a simple disagreement over documentary footage. According to insiders, what's unfolding is something much bigger, a battle over narrative control, reputation, and who gets to shape the historical record of hip-hop culture itself. In an era where a single clip can define public perception within minutes, the stakes around edited reality have never been higher. Behind closed doors, conversations are reportedly intensifying. Some figures are said to be reevaluating relationships, questioning trust, and even reconsidering past collaborations connected to the project. Others are allegedly preparing responses, not necessarily through direct statements, but through interviews, subtle references, and strategic silence designed to avoid escalating the situation further. But not everyone is reacting the same way. There are also claims that certain artists are choosing not to speak at all, not because they have nothing to say, but because the material involved may touch on deeper personal or industry-related issues they are not ready to bring into public view. That silence, however, is only fueling more speculation. Meanwhile, the central figure in this unfolding situation, 50 Cent, remains at the core of the debate. To understand why this moment is hitting so hard, you have to look at his long-standing reputation within the entertainment industry. 50 Cent has never been a passive participant in the culture. He has built his career not just as a rapper, but as a strategist, storyteller, and provocateur who frequently blurs the line between entertainment and real-life tension. Over the years, his work in television, film, and documentary production has expanded his influence far beyond music. He has consistently positioned himself as someone willing to expose uncomfortable truths, challenge industry narratives, and turn private conflict into public discussion. That approach has earned him both admiration and controversy in equal measure. Because when 50 Cent is involved, the story is never just the story, it becomes a spectacle. This latest documentary project appears to follow that same pattern. Early descriptions suggest it contains uncensored moments and candid interactions that some see as revealing, while others view as selectively framed to emphasize conflict and contradiction. That difference in interpretation is now sitting at the center of the backlash. Insiders say multiple rappers featured or referenced in the footage feel they were operating under a different expectation, believing their contributions would be shaped within a controlled narrative environment. Instead, portions of what has surfaced appear to present them in a way they did not anticipate, highlighting tension, disagreement, or inconsistency in ways that may not reflect how they view those moments themselves. This gap between expectation and final presentation is where the conflict is growing. In the world of documentaries, this tension is not new. Artists often agree to participate to tell their side of the story, clarify misconceptions, or shape how their legacy is understood. But when editing decisions shift tone, context, or emphasis, even subtly, the meaning can change entirely. And in hip-hop culture, where reputation carries enormous weight, that shift can feel like a direct challenge to identity. What makes this situation even more volatile is how quickly modern media amplifies it. A single clip, stripped of full context, can circulate globally in minutes. Once that happens, interpretation spreads faster than clarification, and public opinion begins forming long before any official response is issued. That's exactly what appears to be happening now. Some artists are reportedly responding indirectly, through vague posts, interviews, or carefully timed statements that acknowledge tension without naming the source. Others are staying completely silent, possibly waiting for the full release before deciding how to respond. Meanwhile, fans and commentators are digging through old interviews and appearances, trying to connect past behavior with current reactions, searching for clues about what's really going on behind the scenes. At the same time, a broader debate is emerging about documentary ethics in hip-hop culture. Questions are being raised about creative control, editorial responsibility, and how much power a producer should have when real people's reputations are at stake. Some argue that documentaries are always subjective by nature, shaped by the perspective of whoever is telling the story. Others believe that when real lives and careers are involved, there must be stricter standards for fairness and context. All of these tensions are now converging into one high-pressure situation, where perception itself has become the battleground. And at the center of it all remains a single question. Did 50 Cent simply reveal uncomfortable truths the industry has avoided for years? Or has he ignited a backlash that could fracture relationships and reshape alliances across hip-hop? According to those close to the situation, this may only be the beginning. The initial reaction, the leaked footage, and the early responses are just fragments of a much larger unfolding narrative. The real impact, they suggest, will come from what hasn't been fully released yet, and how those final pieces are interpreted once they surface. Because once a story like this escapes controlled environments, it rarely moves in one direction. It expands, shifts, and escalates. And in this case, every new reaction seems to be adding fuel to a situation that is still far from reaching its conclusion. The moment fragments of the documentary footage began circulating beyond controlled circles, the entire situation changed direction almost instantly. What had initially been treated as a behind-the-scenes project quickly turned into a public debate with real consequences. Some individuals reportedly felt their words were lifted out of context, while others argued that the way scenes were arranged created impressions that didn't fully match what actually happened. But the real shift came next. Once short clips reached social media, the conversation stopped being controlled. It became fragmented, fast, and impossible to contain. Viewers began reposting isolated moments, layering them with commentary, assumptions, and emotional interpretations. Within hours, those clips were no longer just footage, they became narratives. And once those narratives formed around specific individuals, they spread rapidly across platforms, hardening into public opinion before any clarification could even be considered. That's when the first wave of tension broke out. Sources claim several artists began reacting almost immediately. Some responded indirectly through cryptic posts. Others made sharper, more pointed remarks that seemed to reference the documentary without ever naming it directly. Fans quickly connected the dots anyway, interpreting silence, emojis, and vague wording as confirmation of frustration behind the scenes. Then came the twist that escalated everything. Insiders allege that certain individuals featured in the footage were not fully aware that specific moments would be highlighted in the final structure the way they were. That detail changed the entire tone of the discussion, because the issue was no longer just that the footage existed, it was how it was framed, and what that framing suggested to the audience. In an industry where reputation is currency, even a subtle shift in context can reshape how an artist is perceived overnight. And that's exactly what appears to have triggered the backlash. As reactions intensified online, a second layer of tension reportedly began forming behind the scenes. Unverified reports suggest internal conversations may already be underway between artists and individuals connected to the production. These discussions are described as cautious but serious, focusing on questions of consent, editorial control, and whether corrections or clarifications might be necessary before the situation escalates further. Meanwhile, social media became a battleground of interpretation. One side argued the footage reveals something raw and unfiltered, moments that expose real dynamics within hip-hop that are usually hidden from public view. The other side pushed back just as strongly, warning that selective editing can completely change meaning when viewers don't have the full context. That divide only widened as influencers, commentators, and breakdown channels entered the conversation, each offering their own analysis, theories, and frame-by-frame interpretations of what the footage really means. And hovering at the center of it all is 50 Cent. For some, his involvement reinforces the idea that the project is meant to challenge narratives and expose uncomfortable truths. For others, it raises a different concern entirely: whether one of the most outspoken figures in hip-hop is shaping perception too heavily through editorial choices that affect multiple careers at once. That tension is what makes this situation so volatile, because it's no longer just about a documentary. It's about influence, authorship, and control over storytelling itself. Then came the second escalation. Anonymous industry chatter began suggesting that the backlash may extend far beyond a few isolated reactions. According to these claims, multiple artists connected to the project are now reviewing their involvement more carefully, reassessing how their appearances are being interpreted, and in some cases, questioning whether their participation reflects what they originally agreed to. If accurate, that signals something bigger than disagreement. It suggests a ripple effect, one that could reach beyond this single documentary and into future collaborations across the industry. As pressure builds, more questions are emerging than answers. Will additional footage be released to add context? Will any of the artists step forward with official statements? Or will silence continue until the next leak or reaction forces the situation forward again? Because right now, the core issue isn't just the footage itself. It's the gap between experience and presentation, between what people believe they agreed to show and what the world is actually seeing. And as more clips circulate and interpretations multiply, that gap only continues to widen. Behind the scenes, things appear to be shifting again. Sources suggest that discussions involving representatives, artists, and production contacts have become more frequent, with growing concern over how the material is being interpreted publicly. While nothing has been officially confirmed, the fact that conversations are happening at all signals how seriously the situation is now being taken. At the same time, the online reaction has entered a new phase. Fans are no longer just reacting, they're investigating. Old interviews are resurfacing, past collaborations are being re-examined. Every previous interaction is being reinterpreted through the lens of the leaked footage, as people try to piece together a larger narrative that may or may not exist. And that's where things become even more complicated. Because once perception takes hold, it starts feeding itself. Commentary channels continue to break down every angle, splitting audiences further into opposing camps. One side sees exposure and transparency. The other sees manipulation and incomplete storytelling. Neither side is waiting for resolution anymore. They're building their own versions of the truth in real time. Meanwhile, 50 Cent remains firmly positioned at the center of the storm, whether by design or by consequence. His history of turning real-life tension into public discourse only adds weight to the current moment, making every move, every silence, and every response feel intentional, even when nothing is confirmed. And now, according to emerging claims, the situation may be evolving again. There are whispers that some participants are not only reacting publicly, but privately reconsidering future involvement in related projects altogether. If that proves true, the impact of this controversy may extend far beyond a single documentary release. It could reshape trust, collaboration, and creative boundaries across the industry. At this point, the situation is no longer a simple backlash. It has become a layered conflict involving storytelling power, reputation risk, and who ultimately gets to define how hip-hop history is documented and remembered. And despite all the reactions already seen, one thing is still missing: a complete, unified explanation that addresses every concern raised from every side. Until that happens, the tension doesn't fade. It builds. The speculation didn't slow down, it accelerated. With every new clip, every reaction, and every unverified claim, the situation moved further away from being a contained controversy and closer to something much larger, a developing moment that could reshape how documentary storytelling is understood inside hip-hop and beyond it. Because once the footage began circulating widely, there was no putting it back into the box. What started as a controlled release quickly transformed into a public storm. Fragments of the documentary involving 50 Cent began appearing across social platforms, and within hours, the conversation stopped being about the project itself. It became about interpretation. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a version of what they thought they were seeing. And that's where the split began. On one side, supporters argued this was exactly the point. A raw, unfiltered look into hip-hop culture, messy, uncomfortable, and real. In their view, the documentary wasn't distorting reality, it was revealing it. But on the other side, critics saw something very different. They raised concerns about framing, editing, and selective presentation. Because without full context, they argued even truthful moments can become misleading. A pause, a cut, or a rearranged sequence can completely shift meaning. And in a world driven by perception, that shift is everything. Then social media took over. And it didn't just react, it dissected. Clips were slowed down, replayed, broken into frames, and re-uploaded with commentary layered on top. Influencers and breakdown channels turned the footage into analysis material, comparing it to past interviews, old appearances, and previous statements in an attempt to decode what was really happening. But instead of clarity, the analysis created more interpretations. More theories, more division. Fan communities began splitting into opposing camps. Some defended the documentary as bold truth-telling. Others accused it of shaping narratives rather than simply documenting them. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds where no side was willing to back down. Then came another layer of tension. Anonymous accounts and unverified posts began circulating online, hinting at missing context, unfinished edits, and unseen footage. None of it was confirmed, but in a situation already driven by uncertainty, even hints were enough to reignite speculation. And as the noise grew louder, industry commentators stepped in. Some pointed out that documentary filmmaking has always walked a thin line between reality and interpretation. Editing is unavoidable. Structure is intentional, and storytelling, even when based on real events, is never completely neutral. Others pushed back harder. Because when real people, Real reputations and real careers are involved. They argued that responsibility becomes heavier. Context isn't optional, it's essential. And right at the center of this debate sits 50 Cent. For some, his involvement reinforces the idea that the project is meant to challenge narratives and expose uncomfortable truths others avoid discussing. For others, it raises a different concern entirely, that his influence, style, and history of confrontation may shape how those truths are presented. Either way, his presence ensures one thing: nothing about this project is being ignored. But the most important detail isn't who is speaking. It's that no single version of the story is holding together. Instead, multiple realities are forming at once, each backed by selective clips, each supported by personal interpretation, each shaped by emotion, loyalty, and suspicion. And that's exactly what keeps this situation alive. Because as long as there are unanswered questions, the conversation doesn't settle, it spreads. Now, just as things seemed like they might stabilize under public debate, a new wave of claims emerged. Unverified reports began circulating suggesting that additional footage may exist, material that has not yet been released. According to these rumors, what the public has seen so far might only be a fraction of the full archive. And that possibility changed everything again. Because if more footage exists, then the entire narrative could shift. It could confirm what people already believe, or completely contradict it, or introduce something nobody is prepared for. That uncertainty is now driving the next phase of the conversation. Some insiders allegedly suggest that discussions are happening behind the scenes about whether more content should be released, withheld, or recontextualized. Others claim participants are reconsidering how they want their involvement represented moving forward. Nothing is confirmed, but the pressure is clearly building. Because at this stage, silence is no longer neutral, it's interpreted. And interpretation is exactly what's fueling the fire. Across social media, fans and commentators are now watching every movement closely, waiting for one thing: confirmation, a statement, a release, a clarification that settles at least part of the debate. But that moment hasn't arrived yet. Instead, what continues to grow is uncertainty. And with it, more questions. Was what we saw the full story, or just fragments arranged to form a specific narrative? Will more footage be released to clarify the missing context? Or will the silence allow speculation to evolve into something even larger? And most importantly, what happens if the next reveal changes everything again? Because this is no longer just about a documentary. It has become a wider conversation about power, perception, and who controls the narrative once real-life moments are turned into public storytelling. And right now, that control is fractured. Every new reaction adds another layer. Every claim expands the debate. Every silence deepens the speculation. So where does it end? At this point, no one can say, because the story didn't conclude when the footage leaked. It only began. And if the latest claims about unreleased material are even partially true, then the most significant developments may still be ahead, waiting to shift the entire narrative once again in ways the public hasn't seen yet. And that uncertainty is exactly what's keeping the entire situation in motion. Because in moments like this, it's rarely the footage itself that drives the story forward. It's what people believe might still be coming next. As speculation continues to build, attention has now shifted away from what has already been seen and toward what has not. Every pause in official communication is being filled with theories. Every silence is being interpreted as a signal. And every unverified claim is being treated by some as a missing piece of a larger puzzle. Behind the scenes, according to scattered and unconfirmed chatter, conversations may still be unfolding among those connected to the project. Not public statements, private discussions, the kind that don't appear online but still shape what eventually does. Some sources suggest these conversations revolve around a difficult set of questions: whether clarification should be provided, whether additional material should be addressed, and whether allowing speculation to continue unchecked is helping or harming everyone involved. But none of that has been confirmed. What is visible, however, is the impact. The conversation has moved far beyond a single documentary release. It is now influencing how people interpret past interviews, past collaborations, and even long-standing relationships within the industry. Moments that once seemed unrelated are now being re-examined under a completely different lens, as if viewers are trying to reconstruct a timeline that suddenly feels incomplete. And that's where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because once public perception shifts, it doesn't reset easily. Even if clarification arrives later, the initial interpretation often stays rooted in the conversation. It becomes part of the narrative itself. That's why the stakes around any potential new footage are so high. If additional material is released, it won't just be viewed as content. It will be analyzed as correction, confirmation, or contradiction. Every second of it will be measured against what people already think they know. And that means the next development, whatever it may be, has the power to either stabilize the conversation or push it into an entirely new phase of conflict. For now, though, the industry remains in a waiting state. Observers are watching closely. Commentary channels are preparing follow-ups. Fans are refreshing feeds for updates that may or may not arrive. And those connected to the situation, directly or indirectly, are navigating a space where responding too early could escalate tension, while staying silent could allow speculation to harden further. It's a difficult balance, and one that rarely holds for long. Because the longer the uncertainty continues, the more interpretations multiply. At this point, there isn't just one story being discussed online. There are several competing versions of it, each shaped by selective clips, personal bias, and incomplete information. And all of them are evolving at the same time. That's what makes this moment different. It's not just about what happened in the footage. It's about who gets to define what it means. And as long as that question remains unanswered, the conversation will continue to expand outward, pulling in new voices, new reactions, and new theories with every passing day. So the situation stands here. A documentary that was meant to present perspective has now become a trigger for interpretation. A set of clips intended for storytelling has turned into fragmented evidence in a much larger debate. And a single project has evolved into a broader discussion about control, reputation, and narrative ownership in modern entertainment. Whether that stabilizes or escalates next depends entirely on what happens behind the scenes from this point forward. Because right now, nothing feels final. Not the reactions, not the claims, and not the story itself. If anything, the silence between updates is becoming its own part of the controversy. And in that silence, the next wave of developments is already being anticipated.